The Catholic Church has guided the moral conscience of over 1 billion people for 2,000 years, built on the singular premise that sin has consequences. Somewhere in that theology, wire fraud, money laundering, and financing the Sicilian Mafia apparently qualified for an exemption. But here is the part that should keep you up at night. The Vatican Bank was never corrupted from the outside. No foreign actor captured it. No rogue employee went off script. It was designed, from the top down, to be invisible to every financial regulator on Earth, using the Church's own divine untouchability as the world's first and most elegant offshore account. So how did the most morally authoritative institution in human history convince itself that sovereign immunity and the grace of God were the same thing? On the morning of June 18, 1982, a postal worker walking beneath Blackfriars Bridge in London looked up and found Roberto Calvi hanging from the scaffolding, his pockets stuffed with bricks and 5.5 pounds of cash in 3 different currencies. He was the chairman of Italy's largest private bank. His friends called him God's banker. The coroner initially called it suicide. Almost no one believed that. But to understand how a man ends up hanging beneath a London bridge with his pockets full of bricks, you have to go back to Rome. Specifically, to a basement. Upstairs, the theater is magnificent. The red silk vestments catch the candlelight in that particular way that seems designed, and it was to suggest divinity brushing up against fabric. The incense smoke hangs in columns beneath the dome of St. Peter's, moving slowly, deliberately, as if God himself is in no particular hurry. The marble is cold beneath the feet of pilgrims who have walked for weeks just to stand in this particular cold. The bells, the Latin, the gold, the accumulated aesthetic weight of 2,000 years of institutional power, all of it arranged to communicate one message. This place is different from every other place on Earth. Downstairs, a telex machine is clattering out encrypted messages to shell companies in Luxembourg. This is the central joke of the Vatican Bank, and it is not actually funny. The institution that invented the concept of sin, that built confession into an architecture of moral accountability, that dispatched missionaries to every corner of the earth to explain to people exactly what God expected of them, that same institution quietly constructed one of the most unaccountable financial entities in the history of money. No windows. No regulatory oversight from any government on earth. Not Italian law. Not American law. Not Swiss law. Nothing. By the 1980s, the bank held assets estimated at over $6 billion, and the precise figure remains unknown because the Vatican has never been required to tell anyone. Imagine building a bank inside a country that is also a religion, so that any attempt to investigate it becomes, theologically speaking, a little bit rude. It is, you have to admit, an elegant arrangement. The formal name is the Istituto per le Opere di Religione, the Institute for the Works of Religion. Founded in its modern form in 1942, officially to manage funds for Catholic charitable works. And it did do that. It also, as we will discover, became the preferred banking partner for the Sicilian Mafia, for Mussolini-era fascists escaping justice through what historians call the rat lines, and for a rotating cast of corrupt politicians whose common thread was simply that they needed money to disappear very quietly. How does this happen? How does an institution built on the specific promise of moral clarity become this? That question has a very long answer, and it begins not with corruption, but with survival. The Vatican's financial anxiety goes back much further than most people realize. Back to the moment when the ground literally shifted beneath the papal throne. Which is where we are going next. For roughly 11 centuries, the Pope was not merely a spiritual authority. He was a king. The papal state stretched across central Italy like a fat diagonal sash from the Adriatic coast to the Tyrrhenian Sea, encompassing what are now Umbria, Lazio, Marche, and Emilia-Romagna. Millions of subjects, enormous agricultural revenues, armies, tax collectors. The whole apparatus of sovereign power worn comfortably beneath the vestments. The church did not need a bank account. It owned the land the bank sat on. Then Garibaldi showed up and things became slightly inconvenient. Italian unification, that great romantic project of the 19th century, was bad news for anyone who happened to be governing large chunks of the peninsula by divine right. One by one through the 1860s, the papal states collapsed into the new Kingdom of Italy. Pope Pius IX watched his temporal empire dissolve piece by piece. Then on September 20th, 1870, Italian troops breached the Aurelian Wall at Porta Pia and marched into Rome itself. The city that had been the physical seat of papal power since the 4th century was gone in an afternoon. Pius IX refused to accept this. He declared himself a prisoner of the Vatican and did not leave the grounds for the remaining 8 years of his life. His successors continued the tradition for nearly 60 years. Imagine choosing to be symbolically imprisoned to make a point and then actually staying there. The stubbornness is almost admirable. Here is where history develops a particularly rich sense of irony. The prisoner pope situation finally resolved not through spiritual triumph, but through a deal with Benito Mussolini. In February of 1929, the Lateran Treaty formalized the Vatican as an independent city-state, and Mussolini, looking to legitimize his regime through papal approval, handed Pope Pius XI a rather extraordinary check. 750 million lire in cash, plus 1 billion lire in state bonds, as compensation for all those lost territories. The Vatican's modern financial empire was seeded with fascist money. The institution that would later condemn moral corruption received its founding investment capital from one of the 20th century's defining examples of it. The Lord, as they say, moves in mysterious ways. That sum, carefully invested, would form the bedrock of the Vatican's investment portfolio, which meant it needed people to manage those investments. Professional people. Financial people. The kind of people who knew what to do with 1 billion lire in state bonds. And it is precisely here in the search for those people that our story begins to get genuinely dark. Bernardino Nogara was not a priest. He was not a cardinal. He was not even, by any particularly rigorous measure, a devout man. He was a mining engineer from Brescia with a talent for numbers, a gift for discretion, and connections to some of the most powerful banking houses in Europe. He had advised at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. He understood how money moved across borders, through governments, through war. He was, in other words, precisely the wrong person to hand a mountain of sacred capital to, if you wanted it to remain sacred. Pope Pius XI hired him anyway. In 1929, fresh from the Lateran settlement, the Vatican needed someone to turn that extraordinary payout into something permanent. Nogara was their man. He arrived with conditions. 3 of them non-negotiable. First, he would invest wherever he judged appropriate with no geographic or political restrictions. Second, he would not be bound by Catholic social teaching in his investment decisions. No doctrinal interference. No ethical filters. Third, absolute secrecy. The church agreed to all 3 without apparently pausing to consider what it was agreeing to. Imagine handing a brilliant, immoral financier a blank check and asking him to sign a confidentiality agreement, then being surprised at what happened next. What happened next was weapons manufacturing. Noguera invested Vatican funds in companies that produced armaments at a brisk clip through the 1930s and 40s, while the church periodically issued statements about the tragedy of war. He invested in real estate across fascist Italy, building a property portfolio in a country whose government had literally just bought the church's goodwill. He invested with extraordinary audacity in companies that manufactured contraceptives. This while the Vatican publicly maintained that contraception was a grave moral offense. The left hand, it seems, had no interest whatsoever in what the right hand was doing. The secrecy made all of this comfortable. Noguera operated through holding companies and intermediaries, structures so layered that even well-informed observers could not trace Vatican wealth to its actual destinations. He built an architecture of financial opacity that would serve the institution for decades and would eventually cause rather spectacular disasters later in the story. But that comes later. Don't worry. By the time Noguera died quietly in 1958, he had accomplished something genuinely remarkable. The Lateran settlement, that lump of fascist compensation, had become a diversified international empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Stocks, real estate, bonds, industrial holdings. The Vatican was no longer an institution that had lost its land. It was an institution that had replaced land with something far more liquid and far less accountable. The church had entered the modern financial world, and it had done so on terms that would make a secular hedge fund manager blush. No ethics. No transparency. No restrictions. Noguera had not merely managed money. He had established a theology of investment, that what belonged to God belonged to no earthly regulatory framework whatsoever. His successors would take that theology and, with considerable enthusiasm, run it directly into the ground. On June 27, 1942, Pope Pius XII signed into existence an institution with a name so bland it could make your eyes glaze over. The Istituto per le Opere di Religione, the Institute for the Works of Religion. It sounds like a committee that organizes bake sales for missionaries. It was not that. Notice first what it was not called. Not the Vatican Bank. Not the Pontifical Financial Institution. Not anything that might suggest it held accounts, moved money, or conducted transactions bearing any resemblance to banking. This was intentional. A bank operates under banking law. An institute for religious works, technically, does not. That single semantic decision, buried in a papal rescript during the second year of a world war, would protect the institution from external scrutiny for the next 80 years. Language is a remarkable tool. The legal architecture was equally elegant in the way that a very well-designed trap is elegant. The IOR sits within Vatican City, which is a sovereign state. It therefore falls under no Italian banking regulation, no European financial oversight, no tax authority anywhere on earth, and carries no obligation to publish balance sheets, submit to external audits, or cooperate with the legal inquiries of any government. It answers, structurally, to a committee of cardinals and above them to the Pope. That is the entire regulatory framework. One man wearing a very tall hat. Don't worry. It gets worse. The war ended in 1945 and Europe began the grim administrative process of accounting for its catastrophes. What followed, in the colder corners of that accounting, were the rat lines, escape networks that carried former Nazi officials and Croatian Ustasha leadership out of Europe before justice could find them. The IOR, according to investigators and historians working through declassified documents decades later, facilitated portions of this movement. Assets, gold, looted currency, moved through accounts that no Allied authority could legally access because no Allied authority had jurisdiction inside Vatican walls. The smell of that money, morally speaking, was considerable. The institution's silence on the matter was absolute. What Nogara had built in financial philosophy, Pius had now formalized in legal structure. An institution invisible to the world, sovereign over itself, answerable to God and, in practice, to no one else. The architecture of invisibility was complete. The question, now, was who would move into it. The answer arrived in the 1960s, wearing an American accent and carrying a briefcase full of ambitions that would eventually make the whole quiet arrangement catastrophically, publicly, unavoidably visible. Paul Marcinkus grew up in Cicero, Illinois, a Chicago suburb so thoroughly organized by Al Capone in the 1920s that locals called it his personal municipality. Whether that neighborhood air contained any formative lessons in sovereign immunity and creative accounting, history does not say. What history does say is that the son of a Lithuanian window washer grew to 6'3", built like a linebacker, smoked cigars with episcopal authority, and became, by 1971, the most powerful banker on earth who had never studied banking. His nickname was the Gorilla. He earned it not as insult, but as credential. In Manila in 1970, a Bolivian painter disguised as a priest lunged at Pope Paul VI with a knife. Marcinkus, then serving as the papal travel coordinator, put himself physically between the blade and the pontiff. The attacker was subdued. The Pope was unharmed. Marcinkus straightened his cassock and carried on. Paul VI, apparently moved by the logic that a man who would take a knife for you deserved a promotion, made him president of the IOR the following year. No banking qualifications were requested. None existed to offer. Marcinkus once explained this problem away with the kind of cheerful pragmatism that should have alarmed everyone in the room. You can't run the church on Hail Marys. It's almost charming, really, if you don't think about what came next. What came next was Michele Sindona. The Sicilian financier had already made himself indispensable to the Vatican's investment portfolio through the 1960s, charming monsignors with returns that seemed, in retrospect, to shimmer slightly too brightly. Sindona had documented relationships with the Gambino crime family. He had relationships with the Mafia that were not particularly hidden from anyone paying attention. Marcinkus paid a different kind of attention. The two men deepened their partnership almost immediately, with Vatican funds moving through Sindona's network of shell companies and international accounts like warm water through a very complicated pipe system. The destination of that water was not always what the brochure suggested. Here is the part worth sitting with, though. Marcinkus did not corrupt the Vatican Bank. The corruption was not his invention. The architecture of invisibility, the sovereign walls, the unauditable accounts, the total absence of any external legal jurisdiction that had been engineered deliberately decades earlier by men who understood exactly what they were building. Marcinkus simply walked into a structure designed to be unaccountable and behaved with considerable energy as though it were unaccountable. He was not wrong. He was just loud about it in ways his predecessors had been careful to avoid. The gorilla had arrived, cigar lit, in a room that had been waiting very quietly for someone exactly like him. The relationships Marcinkus cultivated, the money that moved, and the names attached to it would eventually surface in courtrooms, in headlines, in a body found hanging beneath Blackfriars Bridge in London in 1982. But that story belongs to a man named Roberto Calvi, and it requires its own candlelight. Michele Sindona collapsed Franklin National Bank in 1974 with the casual devastation of a man knocking over someone else's chess pieces. It was, at the time, the largest bank failure in American history. 1,400 employees lost their jobs. Depositors held their breath for weeks. And somewhere in the accounting wreckage, threads led back through shell companies, through mafia cash flows, through a labyrinth of accounts, directly to the IOR. Sindona was eventually convicted on 65 counts of fraud. He died in an Italian prison in 1986, 2 days after drinking cyanide-laced coffee. The official verdict was suicide. His associates considered this explanation creative. By then, however, Sindona was almost a footnote, because Roberto Calvi had arrived. Calvi was everything Sindona was not. Quiet, precise, nervous in the way of a man who knows exactly how many secrets he is holding and exactly how much they weigh. He wore his suits like armor and carried his briefcase with the devotion of a priest carrying relics. As chairman of Banco Ambrosiano, Milan's largest private bank, he had constructed over the course of a decade something genuinely impressive, if you can admire craftsmanship in the dark. The letters were signed, or at least authorized, by Marcinkus. They confirmed, in the careful language of institutional reassurance, that the IOR stood behind these entities. The entities, in the main, did not exist in any meaningful sense. They were names on paper. They were doors that opened onto other doors. Those letters allowed Calvi's phantom network to borrow over $1.2 billion. The press called him God's banker. He hated the nickname. This is, perhaps, the one sympathetic detail available to him. Threading through all of this, like a cold draft through a cathedral in January, was Licio Gelli and his organization Propaganda Do, known to everyone in Italian power circles simply as P2. Gelli was a former fascist with the social ease of a man who had decided, very early, that ideology was simply a networking tool. Propaganda Do was nominally a Masonic lodge. In practice, it was something closer to a shadow government. Its membership list, when investigators finally seized it from Gelli's villa in 1981, read like the guest list for a coup. Cabinet ministers, military commanders, intelligence chiefs, judges, media owners. Nearly 1,000 names. Gelli himself had fled to South America before the raid, which suggests he had better intelligence than the people doing the raiding. The financial circulation of P2 ran, with striking regularity, through the IOR. The Vatican's sovereign walls meant that those flows were simply not visible to Italian regulators. There was nothing to audit. There was no jurisdiction to invoke. The church had not built those walls for this purpose, technically, but the walls worked exactly as well for this purpose as for any other. This is the moral geometry that deserves a moment's stillness. The Vatican's claim to sovereignty was not a convenient side effect of the scheme. It was the scheme's load-bearing wall. Without sovereign immunity, without the guarantee that no Italian magistrate could walk through the IOR's door with a warrant, the entire construction, Calvi's ghost companies, Sindona's laundering pipelines, Gelli's P2 money flows, collapses into rubble. The sanctity of the church, its absolute separateness from secular law, was the product being sold. The grace notes were just money. In June of 1982, Roberto Calvi was reported missing from his Rome apartment. He was found several days later hanging beneath Blackfriars Bridge in London. His pockets had been stuffed with bricks and cash. Banco Ambrosiano collapsed shortly after, leaving a hole of approximately $1.3 billion, a significant portion of which the Vatican Bank would eventually, quietly, and without admission of liability, agree to pay back. Calvi's death was ruled suicide, then ruled murder, then left for years in the comfortable purgatory. On the morning of June 18, 1982, a postal worker named Mauro Collini walking beneath Blackfriars Bridge noticed something heavy swaying from the scaffolding above the Thames. Roberto Calvi, chairman of Banco Ambrosiano, God's banker, the man who had borrowed $1.2 billion on behalf of companies that existed only as ink on paper, was hanging there in his suit. His pockets contained bricks. His pockets also contained the equivalent of roughly $15,000 in British pounds, Italian lire, and Swiss francs. Nobody has satisfactorily explained the cash. It is one of those details that history offers without commentary. The bricks deserve their own moment. This was not a man who had leaped impulsively from a bridge. The scaffolding was difficult to reach. The bricks were not decorative. In the iconography of the Italian underworld, weighting a body is a message, a signature written in stone and river water. The Mafia had used this method before. They would use it again. The London police, working without this cultural context, ruled it suicide within days. Italian investigators, working with considerably more cultural context, disagreed. It would take 2 more formal inquiries before the ruling was finally changed to murder in 2002. 20 years of comfortable ambiguity, which is, in its way, a kind of institutional achievement. The weeks before Calvi's death had been remarkably unpleasant, even by the standards of men who had spent years managing secrets of this particular weight. Italian regulators had spent late 1981 systematically pulling at threads, and by early 1982, the full geometry of Calvi's phantom network was becoming visible. The black hole at the center of Banco Ambrosiano was vast. The shell companies in Panama and the Bahamas, the ghost borrowers, the circular loans backstopped by Vatican letters, all of it was unraveling in the harsh fluorescent light of regulatory scrutiny. Calvi fled Rome on a false passport in June, bounced through several European cities, and made repeated desperate calls to Archbishop Paul Marcinkus at the Vatican Bank. He wanted the Vatican to honor its letters of patronage. He was, in the gentlest possible terms, asking the church to acknowledge that it had guaranteed loans made to companies that did not exist, for purposes that had included, among other things, funding P2 and moving mafia capital through sovereign protected accounts. Marcinkus did not honor the letters. Marcinkus, in fact, did not return the calls. Banco Ambrosiano collapsed on August 6, 1982, less than 2 months after Calvi's body was pulled from the Thames. It was the largest banking failure in Italian history. The Vatican's response to the ensuing investigation was a masterwork of institutional language. The IOR accepted no legal responsibility. It admitted no wrongdoing. It simply acknowledged, in the careful terminology of a very expensive legal settlement, something called moral involvement, and paid $244 million to Banco Ambrosiano's creditors. A voluntary contribution, they called it. Not an admission. A contribution. One imagines the lawyers who drafted that phrase sleeping quite soundly. The money moved quietly. The scandal did not. And the questions it raised about what exactly the Vatican Bank was for and who it was serving would not stay quiet either. Those questions were about to get considerably louder. Archbishop Paul Marcinkus returned to Vatican City in 1987 and simply stayed there. Italian magistrates had issued an arrest warrant for him and 2 IOR subordinates, Luigi Manini and Pellegrino Destrobel, on charges of fraudulent bankruptcy connected to the Ambrosiano collapse. The warrant was real. The intent was genuine. The problem was geography. Italy's Court of Cassation, the country's highest judicial authority, ruled that the Lateran Treaty of 1929 placed Vatican City personnel beyond the reach of Italian law entirely. The warrant evaporated. Marcinkus, a large, golf-playing former bouncer from Cicero, Illinois, was untouchable. Literally. An Italian officer could stand at the edge of Vatican territory and watch him and do absolutely nothing about it. And so Marcinkus lived out his quasi-exile in a manner that is, depending on your tolerance for irony, either darkly funny or genuinely maddening. He played golf. He strolled the grounds. He attended to his duties. He breathed the cool Roman air, presumably free of the particular anxiety that attaches to imminent prosecution. He never faced a single day in court. He eventually retired quietly to Sun City, Arizona in 1990, where he died in 2006, having outlasted the scandal, the investigators, and several of his accusers. Not everyone was so comfortable. Michele Sindona, the Sicilian financier who had introduced Calvi to the Vatican network and helped construct the entire architecture of offshore misdirection, had a considerably less peaceful ending. He was convicted in the United States in 1980 for bank fraud, then extradited to Italy. In March 1986, 2 days after an Italian court convicted him of ordering the murder of a lawyer investigating his affairs, Sindona drank his morning coffee in his prison cell in Voghera and collapsed. The coffee contained cyanide. Whether he administered it himself or received assistance remains, in the grand tradition of this entire story, officially unresolved. He died shortly afterward. The coffee cup, one imagines, was quite ordinary looking. The pattern, if you step back far enough to see it, is almost architectural in its clarity. Every individual who touched the IOR's arrangements during this period was eventually destroyed, imprisoned, or simply turned up dead somewhere inconvenient. Calvi under a bridge. Sindona in a prison cell. others ruined quietly by courts and creditors and the slow grinding weight of exposure. The institution itself paid its voluntary contribution, issued its careful non-apology, and continued operating behind its walls. Which raises the obvious question that Italian magistrates, American prosecutors, and several investigative journalists were already beginning to ask: if the bank survived everything, what exactly was protecting it? Monsignor Donato de Bonis ran the IOR's Special Accounts section through the 1980s and into the 90s with the quiet confidence of a man who had never once been asked to explain himself. And why would he be? The accounts he managed were not listed in any standard register. They existed in a category the Vatican called entities with charitable purposes, which is a genuinely lovely phrase for what Italian investigators later described as a network of accounts allegedly used to funnel bribes to Italian politicians, including the 7-time Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti. Andreotti, for his part, denied everything with the serene composure of a man who had been denying things professionally since 1947. The investigations dragged on for years, produced enormous documentation, and resulted in the particular kind of legal resolution that tends to satisfy no one. De Bonis retired to a monastery. The accounts were quietly restructured. Don't worry. It gets worse. In October of 2010, Italian financial police arrived at the Rome offices of Credito Artigiano and seized 20 million euros sitting in a Vatican bank account. The charge was a violation of Italy's anti-money laundering transparency laws. The IOR had, in the unhurried manner of an institution that had been doing things its own way since 1942, simply failed to identify the origin and destination of the funds. The Vatican expressed surprise. There were meetings. There were statements of cooperation. The seized funds were eventually returned after protracted negotiations, and the IOR paid a fine. The script, if you are keeping track, goes like this: allegation surfaces, Vatican issues denial, investigation proceeds, minimal settlement occurs, promises of reform are announced, silence follows. Repeat every 8 to 12 years until documentary filmmakers run out of chapter numbers. Under Benedict XVI, the Vatican commissioned a series of internal reviews and reform initiatives with names that sound like consulting firm deliverables. They produced, by most assessments, elegant paperwork. The structural reality of the IOR, its exemption from standard oversight, its opacity to outside auditors, its deeply unusual legal position as the financial arm of a sovereign state that is also a church, remained largely intact. The reports were thorough. The shelves received them warmly. The more revealing detail is this. For decades, the Vatican maintained no formal relationship with the Financial Action Task Force, the international body that sets anti-money laundering standards globally, nor with Moneyval, its European equivalent. Other jurisdictions, including genuinely tiny ones, were members. The Holy See was not. It was not an oversight. It was, in the precise technical sense, a choice. External pressure eventually became impossible to ignore. Correspondent banks in Europe began threatening to simply stop processing Vatican transactions. The reputational cost of being effectively treated like an uncooperative offshore jurisdiction by institutions that regularly deal with uncooperative offshore jurisdictions finally produced movement. Which is how it usually works in the end. Not conscience. Not commission reports. Banks threatening to hang up the phone. That external pressure would eventually force something the Vatican had resisted for decades: an actual, external, independent look at its books. What that process found and what the institution did with the findings is where the story takes its most recent and, in some ways, most instructive turn. Pope Francis was elected on March the 13th, 2013, and within weeks, people inside the Vatican were quietly asking whether the IOR would survive the year. The new pope reportedly wanted to close it entirely, shut it down, transfer the assets, end the institutional embarrassment once and for all. He was persuaded by advisors whose names history has not been especially kind in recording that reform was both possible and preferable. This is, in retrospect, the kind of advice that sounds reasonable in a meeting and complicated everywhere else. What followed was the most serious reform effort in the IOR's history, which is a sentence that contains more irony than it initially appears to. Francis appointed a pontifical commission called COSIA to conduct an independent audit of Vatican finances. External consultants were brought in. Accountants, actual ones, with spreadsheets. The atmosphere inside the Vatican's financial offices in late 2013 reportedly had the particular texture of an office where someone has just announced that the emails have been subpoenaed. Quiet. Focused. Faintly cold. Between 2013 and 2015, the IOR closed over 5,000 accounts identified as suspicious, dormant, or belonging to entities that could not clearly demonstrate entitlement to hold them. 5,000. The number rewards contemplation. The COSIA Commission produced findings. It also, somewhat inevitably, produced a leak. The documents, including confidential financial reports and internal communications, found their way to Italian journalists and became known as VatiLeaks II. The commission members were then surveilled by Vatican security services to identify the source. A reforming institution surveilling the people it hired to reform it to catch the leak of documents about the things that needed reforming. The circularity is perfect. Then came London. In 2019, it emerged that the Vatican Secretariat of State had invested hundreds of millions of euros, including funds channeled through the IOR, in a luxury property development in the Chelsea neighborhood of London. The investment had been managed through a network of intermediaries, had generated substantial fees for outside brokers, and had performed, financially speaking, with the same reliable disappointment as most luxury property schemes run by people who are not primarily property developers. Cardinal Angelo Becciu and 9 others face criminal trial beginning in 2021 in Vatican City. The trial, conducted inside the walls of the sovereign state whose financial practices were under scrutiny, in a court system created by that same sovereign state, before judges ultimately accountable to that same institution, stretched on for years. Becciu was convicted in 2023 on charges including embezzlement. And here is the structural truth that no reforming pope, however sincere, has yet been able to dissolve. The Vatican's financial secrecy is not a bad habit or an institutional personality flaw. It is a legal architecture built on sovereignty, reinforced by treaty, and maintained by the same authority that would need to dismantle it. The lock and the key are held by the same hand. Francis opened windows. He hired auditors. He closed 5,000 accounts. The building is still standing exactly where it always was, and the walls remain quite thick. What those walls have protected across 8 decades of practice is a subject that institutions prefer to discuss in terms of lessons learned and ongoing improvement. What history prefers to call it is rather more direct. Sam Bankman-Fried ran a crypto exchange called FTX, wore unwashed shorts to meetings with politicians, and told anyone who would listen that he was only accumulating billions of dollars in order to give them away. This is, structurally, a very old idea. The Vatican did not invent the concept of wrapping financial extraction in the language of divine purpose. But it did spend 80 years building the most durable institutional proof of concept the world has ever seen. The lesson was not lost. What the IOR perfected was a specific kind of regulatory shield, one that functions not through legal technicality alone, but through moral authority so thoroughly established that scrutiny itself becomes the offense. You do not audit the church. You do not subpoena the sovereign. And you do not, without considerable reputational risk, publicly question the intentions of a man loudly promising to save the world. Bankman-Fried called his framework effective altruism. The language was secular, but the architecture was familiar. Good intentions announced loudly enough become a kind of sovereign immunity. When investigators eventually walked into FTX's offices in the Bahamas, they found the same gap the Vatican auditors found, the gap between the stated purpose and the actual function, and it was very wide, and it smelled quite bad. Shell charities and donor-advised funds now perform the same structural role that Vatican sovereign status performed for the IOR. Money enters, designated for purpose. It sits, accumulating. It moves quietly through layers of entities whose names sound like they were generated by a random nonprofit name machine. The tax designation says charitable mission. The financial reality says something more complicated. Auditing is permitted in theory, inconvenient in practice, and rare enough to count as exceptional. The Vatican's real contribution to financial history is not any single scandal. It is the demonstration that when one institution controls both the moral framework and the money, oversight becomes a kind of blasphemy. Tech philanthropy absorbed this lesson enthusiastically. If your foundation funds pandemic preparedness, climate solutions, and global poverty reduction, the journalist asking about your offshore structures is not a watchdog. They are, somehow, a villain. The walls do not need to be stone. They only need to be made of something that feels, to the people watching, more substantial than suspicion. 8 decades of Vatican banking built a template. The template got out. And now it runs on servers, moves through decentralized exchanges, and sits inside foundations named after the men who funded them, all of it wrapped in the warm, certain language of higher purpose. The candle is the same. Only the wax has changed. The Istituto per le Opere di Religione still opens for business every morning inside Vatican City, managing roughly 5.2 billion euros in assets across approximately 33,000 accounts, none of which you will ever see the details of unless the Vatican decides, in its considerable wisdom, to share them. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is the operating structure. The reforms have been real in the way that paint is real. Under Pope Francis, the IOR published annual reports, reduced account numbers significantly, and closed relationships with clients who could not demonstrate a credible connection to the Catholic mission. Genuine reformers exist inside the Vatican. Some of them have spent careers fighting for transparency against an institution that regards full disclosure the way most people regard a root canal, technically survivable but deeply to be avoided. The tension is honest. The problem is structural. When transparency is a voluntary gift rather than a legal obligation, it remains a gift. Gifts can be taken back. Sovereign immunity still holds. No external regulator tells the IOR what to file or when to file it. No outside court compels an audit. The moral authority and the legal architecture are, as they have always been, fused together, and between them they make accountability a courtesy rather than a requirement. Imagine designing that from scratch today. Imagine the reception. Which brings us to a pleasingly circular irony, the kind that would have amused a medieval scholar. The institution that codified the 7 deadly sins, that built confession into a formal sacrament, that wrote the spiritual vocabulary for greed, pride, and sloth, built a financial operation that has spent decades demonstrating at least 3 of them with considerable flair. This is not a contradiction the Vatican has ever seemed especially burdened by. Perhaps when you define the moral framework, you also control the grading curve. Somewhere above the IOR's offices, incense still curls through gilded air. Somewhere below, servers hum quietly, moving money between accounts in the name of charitable works, sovereign and serene, answerable to God, and functionally to no one else. The most elegant corruption has never needed to hide. It only needs to stand somewhere everyone agrees is sacred, speak in the language everyone agrees is good, and wait for the awkwardness of accusation to pass. It always passes. The Vatican did not invent this. But for 80 years and counting, it has been the finest proof of concept the world has ever produced. The bank is still open. The immunity still holds. And the incense, as ever, covers a great deal.